Okay, last factor or determinant of South Korean foreign policy making is economic factor. Let me introduce the trend of Korean major trading partners. Obviously, after the Korean War and in 1965, the Korean normalization with Japan was the largest trading partner for South Korea until 1974. So from 1974, the US became the largest trading partner, and the Cold War collapsed in 1990 until the year 2004. Now, China. So about 20 years, Japan was the largest trading partner. Later, America for about 30 years. And China now is about 20 years. If we look at the status of Korean economic development, when Japan was the major partner, South Korean economy was underdeveloped. When the US was the major partner, South Korean economic status was developing. Now, when the China is the major trading partner, South Korean level of economic development is post-industrial. When South Korean economy is fully developed, China turned out to be a largest trade partner. So Korea's dependence of trade on those three countries has provided a little room for the ROK's policies vis-a-vis those countries. In other words, economic dependence, as many socialist scholars argue, creates political dependence. To a certain sense, it is true. Economic dependence creates, as often, political dependence. So South Korea did not enjoy much of the autonomy in its making economic policies towards these countries. Let me illustrate top 10 trade partners of South Korean economy. First, export partners. Most of the South Korean export goes to China, $136 billion. And second, the US, 75, perhaps half of the China. Third, surprisingly, Vietnam, 48 billion. Next, Hong Kong, 31. And next, Japan, 82. Taiwan, India, Singapore, Mexico, Malaysia. And what about import partners? China. Obviously, China is the largest trade partner. Export as well as import. $107 billion. US, $62 billion. Japan, 47. Saudi Arabia, Vietnam, Australia, Germany, Taiwan, Russia, and Qatar. And these countries, Saudi Arabia and Australia and Russia, Qatar, are resource exporting countries to Korea, energy resources or other materials. And look at this, the export to China and Hong Kong combined. Almost $167 billion. In China, is an import $107 billion. So South Korea has trade surplus with China. Now, let me introduce the top 10 trade partners, particularly the trade in surpluses or trade deficits. Hong Kong. South Korea had the largest trade surplus with Hong Kong, $30 billion. And China. Both of them almost $60 billion. Vietnam, 27. US, 11 billion. India, Singapore, Mexico, Philippines, Poland, Turkey. Deficits in its trade with partners. Japan, $19 billion. Saudi Arabia, the energy source, 18 billion. Australia, other resource products, the beef and lumber and some other minerals and these days Australian wine. Qatar, energy. Germany, machineries. Kuwait, energy. Russia, energy. Iraq, energy. Arab Emirates, energy. Italy, luxuries. Luxuries. So South Korea imports machineries and sophisticated products from Japan, Germany, and luxuries from Italy, and it imports the other energy supplies from these energy-rich countries. And what kind of countries are having trade surplus with China? Because in many countries, people say we have trade deficit with China, trade deficit. But some countries have trade surplus with China. Perhaps three groups of countries tend to have trade surpluses with China. Three groups. First, resource-rich country like Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Australia. And this first group of commodity exporters is easy to understand because China imports a tremendous amount of energy sources, in order to maintain its manufacturing capabilities. Second group is luxury goods exporters like Switzerland, the watches and other sophisticated products from Switzerland. Second group of luxury exporters is also easy to understand. China is the largest market for a lot of luxury goods in the world. The largest market for the luxury goods in the world, from Switzerland, Italy, and France, and the UK too, and America also, and Japan. And third category is quite interesting. Highly industrialized upstream exporters like Germany, Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan. So in third category, China often acts as a passing through for the industrial exporters. Passing through, because China imports parts, mostly parts, from these countries, Germany, Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan, and assemble them in China. And export them to outside. But all of these merchandise are considered to be made in China. So China often acts as a passing through for industrial exporters that ship their highly engineered and high value components to factories in China. And China assemble it, make finished products, and export them. So China has no other choice but to have trade deficit with these countries. If we look at the patterns of Korean trade, we can find two peculiar things. First, Korea exports mostly from Asian countries and the US. Korean export to mostly Asian countries and the United States. And Seoul exports IT products and machineries and particularly intermediaries to Asian countries and to the United States. Intermediaries. So these days, most of the intermediary products are sent to China and Vietnam. And Vietnam is maintaining a huge assembly lines of Korean intermediary products. China, same thing too. So Korean export partners are mostly Asians and the US. In other words, Korean export are heavily determined by geography. But second, Korean major partners in import are Japan and the US, China, Germany, and oil producing countries. So it seems to me that the Korean imports are less determined by geography. And Seoul imports machineries and high-tech equipment from Japan and Germany, and energy sources from the Middle East. So Seoul has the high depends of its energy source on the Middle East, but the machinery and high-tech equipment from Germany and Japan. So I think this is a finding of this slide, but this is also a significance and also problem of South Korean economy. So in other words, South Korean economy should not be depending on geography that much. In other words, it has to multiply the partners and exports and imports in all over the world. In sum, South Korean trade pattern has been largely conditioned by geography and levels of technological development. Korean FDI is a foreign direct investment, and fluctuation of energy price and energy supply.